Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's presentation in the Auschwitz Speaker Series. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and I'm the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. Today, we are in a webinar format, and we're going to be joined by our speaker shortly. If you have questions through the course of his presentation, we encourage you to put those in the question and answer feature, and we'll be joined at the end by MCHE's historian, Dr. Shelley Klein, who will moderate those questions to Dr. Baumgartner. Before we get to our speaker, it's my pleasure today to introduce our partner, the President and CEO of Union Station, Kansas City, George Costello.
Thank you, Jessica. It's great to see you. And also, it's hard to believe that it's been almost 1 year since we made this announcement to the community, as we held hands and crossed the street together with the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. We had a deep belief that this exhibition would be transformable in our community. When we looked to a partner, we found no better partner than our friends at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. What an opportunity for us to work together to be able to tell the rich story and support the mission of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. And that is to ensure that everyone in this community has a better understanding of the atrocities that happened and how we must never happen again, and also educate our community. We were always hopeful that this exhibition would educate, but it's a much deeper education now that we're partnering with the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. Today is a perfect example of telling that rich story. But before I do and turn it back to you, the results have been quite impressive. I'm pleased to tell you today that over 160,000 people have already purchased tickets to this exhibition in a 7-week short time frame. We've added time frames in the morning to handle the demand. But it's not just an exhibition that people are spending nearly 3 hours to learn information, and what we're going to learn today is so well a testimonial within the exhibition. But I wanted to share with you some comments that the community is saying about this exhibition that I think really allows us the opportunity to tell and make a difference in our community. We've received nearly a 100% net promoter score in our exhibition. That's almost unheard of in today's world, for people universally saying this was the most important exhibition of their lifetime. And hopefully they join us for these presentations. Just last week, we did a movie premiere experience with the producers of Big Sonia, and how fortunate we were to have Sonia here as one of our very first guests. And someone in the audience raised their hand and said, we really support the work of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. And we're so pleased that they're partners and join you in telling this story. Let me give you some examples of what people are saying. One person, Alex, wrote, "Thanks to all who made this possible. Surely the most significant exhibition of my generation. A powerful reminder to live life to the fullest and stand against all injustice." And Amanda, who's 16, wrote, "As a 16-year-old who isn't very fond of history, this really hit me." So I think let the words of our exhibitor, our guests, be our guiding light to continue to change our community. I hope all of you today enjoy and really learn from today's presentation so that you can share a deeper understanding with others in our community of why we're doing what we're doing. On behalf of the board, on behalf of our staff, we say welcome, and please join us to see the exhibition, but most important, tell that story to others. And let's ensure that the work of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education continues to make a vitally important change in our community. Jessica, thank you for letting us partner with you.
Thank you so much, George. From the very first conversations, it was always critical to Union Station that this be educational, that it was not a field trip without substance. And the exhibit does that, but their commitment to partnering on this speaker series has demonstrated that commitment beyond anything that we could have hoped. This has allowed us to reach an international audience. It has allowed us to reach people who do and do not have the benefit of seeing this exhibition. And so when we went to them and started to discuss topics for this speaker series, when we discussed potential speakers that we could bring to this, one of the first things that was discussed, something that was very important to us, was making sure that we appropriately addressed the experiences of non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust. And in particular, the Roma experience of the Holocaust is central to the Auschwitz story. It is a story that's told very well and very explicitly in this exhibition. And so it is my pleasure then today to be able to introduce our presenter on what is a very significant anniversary. It was 77 years ago today that the Roma camp within Auschwitz-Birkenau was liquidated. It was on August 2nd, 1944, when the Roma, Sinti, and Laleri people who had experienced persecution before the Holocaust, had experienced persecution within 1930s Germany, and then had experienced persecution in ghettos and camps within the Holocaust system. August 2nd was a very significant date in their history as a people, and we wanted to honor that date by having this presentation now. Exact numbers are very difficult to ascertain, but we know that at least 250,000 Roma, Sinti, and Laleri people were murdered in the course of the Holocaust, and there are historians who put that number closer to 500,000. So a very significant victim group in the Holocaust that many people do not have a good understanding of that experience. And so it's really my pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Gerhaud Baumgartner. He is the Director of Research at the Documentation Archive of the Austrian Resistance. He's held numerous prestigious lectureships and researchships throughout both Europe and Israel. And before taking up his post at the Documentation Center, he was the Senior Research Fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. His own research focuses on the areas of resistance and persecution, especially from 1938 to 1945, and the history of persecution of the Roma and the Sinti. He's the author of numerous works, but I'm going to particularly point out his book, The Fate of the European Roma and Sinti During the Holocaust, which I believe probably forms the basis of most of what he's sharing with us today. So Dr. Baumgartner is with us from Vienna, a minor miracle that has come out of 2020 that we're now able to be joined so easily by our international presenter. So thank you, Dr. Baumgartner, for spending your very late evening with us and teaching us about this important topic.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Thank you very much, Shelley, and all the rest. I feel very honored to be able to speak to you. I hope you can hear me quite well from Vienna. And as you said, tonight is a special night. And I think it's a very good occasion to talk about what really happened to the Roma and Sinti during the Holocaust. And I will be sharing my presentation here, which is a PowerPoint presentation with a lot of photographs. And I will try to take you through this story by, so here we go. By clarifying a little bit of terminology. So usually, historically speaking, It's the term gypsies that comes up in most of the documents, or Zigeuner, as in German, and that was the term that the Nazis would use. We today speak about Roma and Sinti, and the singular plural for one of them would be Rom and Romni, then in the female form, or Sinto or Sintica. Where do they come from? The Roma are a people that left North Central India around the year 500 of the current era, and moved, as you can see, through Persia, what is nowadays Afghanistan and Persia and Turkey, and they reach Europe around the year 1000, and from there on they come into Europe basically between 1300 and 1500. Now, many people would ask, what is the difference between Roma and Sinti? The first groups that arrive and that they cross the Alps and then they come into France, Spain, northern Germany, England, Scandinavia, they will later call themselves Sinti. Where the word comes from, we don't know, but all the rest of the Roma populations, and the Sinti are also part of the Roma population, they refer to themselves as Roma. They are the only second group which are being systematically persecuted by the Nazis under the Nuremberg Laws, meaning they are barred from schooling, they lose all their citizens' rights, and they are systematically persecuted and incarcerated. What are the differences between the persecution of the Jews and the persecution of the Roma and Sinti by the Nazis? First of all, discrimination, marginalization, and persecution starts for the Roma well before the Third Reich. The second very important difference is that they are being persecuted by different institutions of the Third Reich. So this is something that historians have found out very late, and this also accounts for, let's say, a very big time gap, actually, a delay in Roma research, because historians have basically been looking at the wrong kind of documents. And the third difference is that discrimination, marginalization, and persecution continues for quite some time after the Third Reich. Today, I want to go into the first two of these points. We will not talk about what is happening after 1945 so much. There will be some time for that, actually, I hope, when we come to the discussion in September, when we can do this. So for the persecution that already starts well before the Nazis come to power, and which enable actually and make this persecution possible, there are four contributing factors that I want to point out. First, that there are romantic stereotypes about the so-called gypsies all over Europe since the 19th century. Second, there is a tradition of policing migrants, travelers, and gypsies well since the 19th century. The third point is something that happens basically in the 20th century, which is the rise of eugenics. And then, of course, there is the economic crisis of the interwar years. Let's start with the romantic stereotypes. In the 19th century, the Europeans develop a kind of stereotype about gypsies, which depicts them as a kind of the last savages of Europe. That's what they are called, actually. The last noble savages of Europe, who sort of lead a quite happy life outside of European civilization. As you can see in this painting, they are sort of whiling away their time, smoking, fiddling, sleeping through the day. This is, in the beginning, a very positive stereotype, but very quickly in the 19th century, it is going to become quite ugly. But basically, there is one thing that we have to point out. For the dissemination of this stereotype, photography and the invention of photography plays a crucial role. Photography, invented in 1826, spreads through Europe like a wildfire, and there is special kinds of little photographs, which is called carte de visite photographs, so calling card photographs, very small ones. They are being sold in the tens of thousands. There is three topics, which is the crowned heads of Europe, murderers and their execution, and the third one is the noble savages of Europe, the Roma. And all of a sudden you have 10,000 of photographs about these people which are being presented to the public and which establish a very strong stereotype about these wild men. So if you look closely, you will see that all these photographs have been shot in studios. Yeah? And they are basically not photographs of that the Roma families would actually make of themselves. So by 1910, as you can see on this postcard from Czechoslovakia, the prototype, this stereotype is well established. We have this family, they are in the middle of nowhere, so there is no trace of a European civilization. You see there is no buildings, nothing. And Papa is fiddling, Mama on the left is smoking a pipe, something that women didn't do in 1910. The children are sort of dancing. So it's this happy gypsy life, which is of course a complete invention and only typical of a very small percentage of the Roma population, even in 1910. How strong the stereotype is, we can see that it comes up in all kinds of fields of culture. Like, for example, we have a painting by Van Gogh here of a gypsy camp with the same kind of arrangement here. Of course, there were wandering Roma at that time, but as we now know today, they accounted for about 10% maybe of the Roma population of Europe only, probably less. Yeah? You have lots of traveling people, not necessarily all of them Roma, at the beginning of the 20th century. And you can see we have a photograph here. These are either migrant workers or people who are moving from country fair to country fair, fruit pickers, etc. Not all of them are gypsies or so-called Roma, but many are branded as gypsies by the police. Here we have a photograph of 1920 from Germany, from the town of Halle, which is a Sinti family. But you can see that when they have their photograph taken, they want to present themselves in a completely different way. And they are not all of them are very poor. If you look at the car, and the make of the car, which you can see here on the right, that you will discover it's a Mercedes. So even in 1920, this was not one of the cheapest cars. So not all of them are necessarily poor. Another very famous and visible section of the Roma population of Europe are the professional musicians. We are in the time before television. In every seaside hotel in Europe, you have professional musicians making music in the evening. Many of them are Roma, and they are professional musicians who've had professional training at musical academies for centuries. So they come from professional or families of professional musicians, as Europe has had for many, many centuries, actually, like Mozart, where everybody in his family was a musician since the 16th century, or like here with these Roma. And of course, you have completely, assimilated Roma families here. This is actually a Sinti family from Germany in the 1930s, where many families have moved from, traveling the country and the country fairs with their rides. They have moved into the cinema business, running cinema theaters in Germany. This is one of these families, owners of a big cinema in the Rhineland. So the population is very, very diverse. In Central and Eastern Europe, most of the Roma live like this. Most of them are agricultural workers, and they are settled Roma. So this is something quite outside of the stereotype, but most actually about 80% of the Roma population of Central and Eastern Europe by the turn of the century, so the beginning of the 20th century, are settled Roma, and they live in these villages, working as farmhands in the summer and trying to supplement their income by weaving baskets, producing wicker furniture like here, working as scissor grinders, tinkers, you know, these things, and they are being controlled by the police very often. So here we come to a second very important point. I've pointed out the role of photography, but here you can see it. If you go back, you will realize that on all these photographs, like here, the second from the right, there is a policeman there. And most of the photographs that we have from the interwar period are actually photographs taken by the police. So police photography will influence the perception of the Roma for the whole century, actually. So there is very few photographs that are non-police photographs right up till the middle of the 20th century. And you see, and of course, these photographs are taken by the police not in order to document the life of the Gypsies, but to document the very difficult work of the police with the so-called Gypsies. And these photographs are later published in journals, special journals of the criminal police, and are actually there till today. So we have to be very careful. In former times, many researchers have mistaken these photographs actually for something of a documentation of everyday life. I've said that there are 4 factors which we have to take into account if we want to explain how the genocide of the Roma and Sinti became possible. The first one has to do with the police. It's registration. Registration starts in Europe in 1912. It is France that starts the registration of all non-sedentary persons, of all migrants. And they are being issued with a modern document, something like we have now, or all of us have now, with a photograph and with fingerprints. You can see the smudges on the lower end of this document. It is called the Carnet Anthropométrique, so anthropometric document. And this starts the registration of travelers, basically, many of them Roma and Sinti. And this idea is picked up then by the Interpol, the International Police Organization, which is founded in 1924 in Vienna. And the work of Interpol at that time, which is basically a conference of criminal police organizations from all over the world, focuses on 2 topics. The one is actually quite anti-Semitic. It is the trafficking of girls from Eastern Europe to America, always under the assumption that these people who finance this kind of migration are trafficking girls for brothels in America. And the second stereotype is Roma, Gypsies. And so it is the criminal police who becomes responsible for the monitoring of Roma in the 1920s. And we will see in the 1930s and 40s, so also under the Nazis, that the persecution of Roma is not by the Gestapo, but by the criminal police. So this was the mistake of historians who have been looking for documents, like we have documents about the persecution of the Jews in the Gestapo files, but there were no documents to be found about the persecution of the Roma. And it took us a long time to realize the Gestapo was not involved. It was the criminal police who actually did all the monitoring and later the deportations. So here we have different documents, so documentation and of the Roma. It starts in France, but in the 20s we have it in Germany, we have it, as you can see here, in the Czech lands, we have it in Austria, we have it in Hungary, and it's well before the Nazis come to power. So the municipalities join in, and they have special registrations for somebody for their so-called gypsy population. And you can sort of generalize and say, if you are unfortunate enough to be classified a so-called gypsy either by the police or by the local administration in the interwar years, you will later be deported into a concentration or extermination camp by the Nazis in the 1940s. If not, you will probably escape. There's many cases where people move from their place of origin, where the family is registered as a gypsy family, to a different part of the country where they work throughout the war, and nothing ever happens because in this town they are not sort of known as so-called gypsies. So registration is the first. Eugenics. Eugenics, you are probably familiar with this. Today we know that it's a pseudoscience, but at the beginning of the 20th century, everybody was convinced that it was a real science. And it is basically the assumption that human behavior is hereditary, and especially that criminality is a hereditary feature. It spreads from the Americas, from the United States actually, over to Europe, where it is taken up, first of all in Switzerland, interestingly enough, and then spreads throughout Europe. It is not invented by the Nazis. It is taken up by the Nazis, and it will not end with the Nazis. So after registration, eugenics, the third factor which contributes to the persecution of the Roma is the world economic crisis and a completely inefficient system of social welfare in most of the countries. When we look at photographs from the 1930s of Roma settlements and Roma groups, we can see that these people are desperately poor. What is happening here is that, as I said, most of the Roma of Central and Eastern Europe were actually either traveling from country fair to country fair, which is more in Western Europe. They are being excluded more and more from the local markets because the local shopkeepers, etc., fear their competition. And in the East, these people are agricultural workers. What happens during the economic crisis is that lots and lots of unemployed from the cities return back into their villages of origin. And they push the local Roma who've been sort of working during the harvests out of the local labor market. The Roma start to starve. They are actually dying. A very good indicator for what is happening there is child mortality. Child mortality in Roma settlements in Central and Eastern Europe rises to over 50% in the 1930s. So every second child will die before its second birthday. It is a horrendous sum. It's inconceivable to us. We have a child mortality rate in the so-called first world of 14 per 1,000 children. This is over 50 out of 100. So these people are really dying of hunger. They are completely destitute, and that is the problem. In this system, it is always the village where these people live that has to keep them. They have to pay, and now this is it. They have to pay if one of them becomes ill and has to go to hospital. The village has to cover the costs of hospitalization. If a woman giving birth has to see a doctor, the village, and she can't pay, the village has to pay for it. When the children go to school, there is a school fee that has to be paid, and if they can't pay, the village has to pay for it. So a lot of local conflicts erupt because of this big problem, because the Roma population is actually sometimes very large. You have small farming communities of 100, 200, 300 people that have to look after. Roma population of 100 persons. So sometimes the proportion is even 1-to-1 nearly. So this is an untenable situation, and racism erupts all over the place. One of the famous so-called Gypsy conferences that is being held in Austria in 1933, so well before the Nazis come to power in Austria or before the Nazis invade Austria, is a conference of mayors of affected villages and towns. Here they meet in this city of Oberwart, and during the conference they look at the Roma settlement. Here we see them, and you can see the houses or the huts of this settlement in the back. The agenda of this conference is completely racist. The people and the ideas that are being proposed by the participants, and don't forget, these are representatives of democratic parties, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, German nationalists. The solutions that they suggest is, we will create something like an Indian reserve as we have in America. We might actually throw them into a kind of workhouse where they have to do forced labor. We could deport them to an island in the Pacific Ocean, etc. So all these ideas are already there. And one of the participants actually starts his presentation with the words, "Since we can't kill them, we have to find a different solution." So the formulation is in the negative, but the idea is already present there. So what do the Nazis add to this when they annex Austria in 1938 for Austria? But what do they add to this situation in general? First of all, the Nazis implement a state and a society organized along racist principles. This can't be anything new to you, but there is a second element, which is the element of crime prevention. Now, this crime prevention, a term which was actually coined by the Nazis, but they meant something completely different. It's not, today we use this term crime prevention when we talk about how to secure your doors and windows, how to keep burglars out. At that time, crime prevention, as used by the Nazis, was actually a logical sequence of eugenics. So if you are convinced that criminality is a hereditary feature that you are being born with, and that people are more or less condemned to become criminal during the course of their lives, why wait till they have committed a crime? It would make more sense to lock them up before they get the chance to commit a crime. And this is actually the stance that the Nazis will adopt. This is their idea of crime prevention. Locking up everybody who might become a criminal, especially the so-called gypsies, because there they are convinced that they are all sort of born criminals. Also an expression that comes from this time and from this theory. So in 1935, the Nazis passed the so-called Nuremberg Laws, which are meant for the Jews and for Roma, so for so-called gypsies, and for nobody else. And immediately the persecution starts. In several German towns, the municipalities establish a special quarter, a camp, a gypsy camp, which is actually in one instance in Nuremberg, it is actually called a concentration camp. It is at the outskirts of the cities, and the Roma and Sinti are forced to relocate to these camps. I will show you some photographs immediately. And of course, there is this idea of racial hygiene. So this has to do with eugenics, so how to prevent the intermarriage of Roma and non-Roma, also, of course, of Jews and non-Jews, but in this case, it's not Roma and non-Roma. And the people who do it are these two persons that you see here, Dr. Robert Ritter and Eva Justin. They will collect over a period of 7 years data of about 20,000 German Roma and Sinti, and later on these profiles will be used for, when it comes to the deportations to the concentration and extermination camps. But in the beginning, they are usually used to force people to get sterilized. So usually they force Roma and Sinti to get sterilized to prevent them having more children or having children at all. And this is when Roma and Sinti start to flee the territory of the German Reich. So after 38, 37, 38, they start to get out of the German Reich and they try to get into Italy. They try to go sometimes to Spain, France, Spain, but also the Balkans and Eastern Europe. So here you see Dr. Robert Ritter, who is actually putting together one of his files. Here he is taking a blood sample. Their work is very well documented, actually, with lots of photographs. Here is his colleague Eva Justin. Okay, so what happens now? What does the persecution look like? First, it starts with internment and forced labor. So as I said, people are put forcefully, they have to relocate into camps. In several instances, as in Austria, already the first groups are being deported to concentration camps because they are needed as workers in these new concentration camps where the SS has established contracts with big German enterprises and they need the cheap workforce. The SS had this kind of deal with the Nazi state to say, you let us deal with the Jews and the Gypsies and it will cost you nothing, and we will run these camps on money that we make from this forced labor. So that was the initial idea. Never worked out like this, but this is why they need, right from the beginning, they need young, strong, able-bodied men and women. And these are the first ones that are being deported into these camps. And later on, after the first municipal camps and the first labor camps come the first collection camps. We will come to that in a moment. Here you can see one of these internment camps in Düsseldorf. The city erects these at the outskirts of the city, and the Roma and Sinti families have forcefully, they are being relocated there, and they are not allowed to leave. Only if they can prove that they have work somewhere, then they can go out. In 1936, for example, Berlin holds the Olympic Games of 1936, very famous in America. Jesse Owen wins a gold medal there, very much to the annoyance of Adolf Hitler. But when the Nazis try to prepare the city for the Olympic Games, they force all the Roma and Sinti out of the city and they create a special camp for them in the north of the city in a part of Berlin that is called Marzahn, so in 1936. And then they like this idea very much, and they never let them out again till they are being deported. And the people that you see here living in these gypsy wagons, they were not all of them had been living in gypsy wagons. Many of them had to leave their flats and had to relocate into this kind of housing, actually, in 1936. And forced labor, as you can see here, is introduced immediately after the so-called annexation of Austria. Here you see Roma working on a road construction project as forced labor in 1938, 1939, guarded by an SA, local SA man. And this are some other Roma working as forced laborers in the Alps, and they are mainly used as forced labor for the construction of roads and dams in river regulations, etc., in 38 and 39. And as I said, some others are being already deported to Ravensbrück and Buchenwald and Dachau. So here you have some of the first Austrian Roma being deported to Dachau in 1939. Another picture of Austrian Roma in Dachau, and here the women in Ravensbrück. Now, the very tragic aspect of these deportations of 38 and 39 is the following. These were young, strong, able-bodied people who were chosen because they were good workers. And their rate of survival is much higher than for the rest of the Roma population. So when these men and women who survived the concentration camps, as I've mentioned, these Western concentration camps, when they return to their homes, to their villages, they will realize that all their family members, but especially all their children, have been deported and killed by the Nazis. So this is a completely devastating shock that is awaiting these women that you can see here. So the problems with these deportations is that they are not very effective, or they have a completely unexpected effect. The local populations, as I told you, where there were lots of conflicts with these completely impoverished Roma, they ask for the deportation. Yeah, they plead and write letters to the central authorities in Berlin. Please get rid of these Roma, get rid of these Roma. And that's what the administration does. So, but they first take out the good workers, the able-bodied people, which means that there is even fewer people who are earning money in these Roma communities. So the villages have to pay even more for their upkeep. So the more you deport, the more you have to pay. So it's a vicious circle of rising costs of social welfare. And then around 1940, the Nazi administration says, okay, enough, we will get rid of them all. And they start, first they try a little kind of experimental deportation in 1940 of 2,500 German Sinti to Poland. This goes completely wrong. There is no infrastructure for them. There is no camp where they are. It goes wrong. Most of them, or many of them, actually return to Germany. Others try to hide in Poland. This doesn't work. So the second solution is that they establish a special gypsy camp in a place called Luckenbach in eastern Austria, which will eventually house between 4,000 and 5,000 Roma. From these deportations of the years 1940, there are some good photographs. Here is the one from Asberg in Germany, where you can see this deportation to Poland. Again, it is mainly men that are affected, so workers. So if you look here, there is another photograph of this deportation. You can see the men are on the train, the women are staying back home. There is no children that you can see. They are being taken to Belzec in Poland. This photograph is of Roma in Belzec, but it is probably a later photograph. So this is also a problem for historians, that many of the photographs that we have are not very well documented. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, historians were not very choosy when it came to using photographs, and they were stealing, borrowing, copying, and substituting one photograph for the other very often. So you have to be very careful when you use one of those. This is probably not the German Sinti, but a later group. Maybe it's Belzec. We have no proof of that. So I told you already about this vicious circle of rising costs of social services, but this will explain why these and how these big camps are being established, like this one here, this Gypsy camp in Luckenbach. You see, it is being guarded by a member of the Vienna Criminal Police. You can see him here. These are the Roma and Sinti of the region that are will be brought or are being brought into the camp, and the camp is organized by the social service institutions of the provinces. It is not being organized by the Gestapo or by the SS or anybody else. It's the social service, the welfare institutions that actually finance these camps, and it is the welfare institutions that will finance the deportation of the inmates into the concentration camps starting in 1941. And it took us ages to realize this. And once we realized it, we actually found most of the documents that we had been looking for decades. Yeah? So here you have the largest Roma camp on the territory of the German Reich, which was Camp Luckenbach. And from here, the people who are being brought here, their property is confiscated, it is being sold off in an auction, the money is transferred to the camp administration, and of course they have to do forced labor in all kinds of enterprises in the vicinity. Another of these collection camps in 41 is here in Western Austria, Camp Wyatt, which is actually close to Salzburg. And we have a very interesting series of photographs because a doctor who used to visit in the camp took these photographs shortly before they were deported to Poland. And and in 1941, when the Einsatzgruppen are already doing their bloody work in Eastern Europe, killing Jews and Gypsies indiscriminately all over the place, the deportations start. The first deportation, really big deportation, is of 5,000 Austrian Roma and Sinti, which are being deported into the Jewish ghetto in Litzmannstadt, in what is nowadays Lodz, as we say in German, Łódź, as they say in Polish. We know everything about this deportation. We know when the trains left. We know when the trains arrived. There were 5,007 people on the trains. 11 were dead on arrival. These are the parents, so the elderly, and the children of those people that had been deported in 1939 to the concentration camps in Germany, Dachau, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück. 60% of these 5,000 are children under 12 years of age. And they are being put into 5 buildings in Łódź. The buildings are standing till today, and they are being, at the moment, converted into a kind of memorial by the city administration. Already there is a small museum there if you ever get to go there. It's a very interesting site, very interesting presentation. Horrible. There were about 50 people to a room, so this is 5 houses with about 50 people to one room. Typhoid fever breaks out, about 600 people die in the first weeks, and then the Nazi authorities of Litzmannstadt, Łódź, decide to have all the inmates of this gypsy camp killed, and they are being transported another 100 kilometers to one of the first extermination camps, which is called Kulmhof in German, in Chełmno nad Nerem in Poland. And they are all either gassed or shot, we don't know exactly. And their mass grave has just been discovered 4 or 5 years ago. And since 2017, there is a memorial stone. We know everything about this transport. What we don't know is the name of the victims. The transport lists have so far eluded us. So we don't know who the victims of these transports were. Another photograph here of these things. And then in 1943, finally, we come to the big deportation to Auschwitz. In December 42, you know this, there is this so-called Auschwitz Order, Auschwitz Erlass by Heinrich Himmler, who says that all the gypsies, on the basis of their race, as he says, have to be deported to Auschwitz. Mengele arrives in May together with most of the Roma and Sinti being deported to Auschwitz, and he will start his infamous experiments with lots and lots of Roma children. In May, also on May 16, there was apparently a kind of uprising, a revolt in the Roma and Sinti camp, where apparently the Roma and Sinti managed to chase away the SS guards who wanted to take them to probably the gas chambers. We don't know. So this event is rather badly documented, but I'm mentioning it here because it has started to play a very important role in the new discourse of generations of young European Roma as a kind of instance of, yes, revolt, something to be proud of, a symbol of the resistance of the Roma in the camps. And then, of course, as we've already heard, the most of the people deported there, and this is close to 23,000, are dead. 70% of them will die till the summer of 1944. And in 44, when already the Soviet front is approaching, there is a kind of selection taking place in the so-called Gypsy Camp. And a large part of the inmates of, sorry, I made a mistake here. Let's go back. So, and everybody who seems to be able to work is being selected, and they are being transferred to back into the German Reich to other concentration camps, mainly to Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen, and the remaining 3,000, maybe not even that, are being gassed in one night. And since the late 1990s, the 2nd of August has become the major memorial day of the European Roma communities to remember the Roma genocide by the Nazis. And since the late 1990s, there is a very big memorial event there in which I have participated for most of the last 20 years. In the last 2 years, it could not be held. This year, there is a kind of event which is taking place in Krakow, but not at the site. But we hope that next year we will be able to come back to that. So here you have a photograph that you will sometimes see as depicted, or it is claimed that it depicts Roma. It is actually not true. These are Hungarian Jews. At their arrival, we have no photograph of Roma in Auschwitz-Birkenau. The only photograph which actually does depict one of the barracks in Auschwitz-Birkenau in which Roma were housed is this one. And what you can see is in the end, in the center of the picture, there is a chimney. And this chimney runs along actually the floor of the whole barracks, and where we are standing now, there would be a big kind of oven which is being heated in the winter, and the inmates would drop their usually wet winter clothes onto this kind of chimney to get them dry. So this is a system of heating, an improvised system of heating and drying, the only one that the inmates had. So that's what we can see there. This is, sorry, Um, in the German occupied territories, the persecution of Roma and Sinti has been a topic of research for the last 20 years, and some facts have been established. So in the Czechlands, two big camps have been identified and are being currently turned into memorial sites. The one is the Gypsy Camp at Lety u Písku, north of Prague. The other one is Hodonín u Kunštátu, which is near Brno, if you are familiar with Czech geography. In Slovakia, there was a big work camp in Dubnica nad Váhom, which is sort of not too far away from Bratislava. In Serbia, there is a lot of very, very good research going on at the moment, rather new, and it has documented a lot of mass executions which were carried out in retribution for partisan attacks by the German army, basically. And usually they were either Jews or so-called gypsies that were being shot. The ratio was 100 hostages being shot for one soldier killed. So this was a real bloodbath. Yeah. So Pančevo, Šabac, but also the vicinity of Belgrade. There is first publications are sort of coming to light there. And of course, we have the Soviet Union, Poland, and the Baltics, where it is mainly something that is called Holocaust. Holocaust by bullets, where places of mass execution have been identified over the last 10 years. Just to give you a figure of comparison, in Poland alone, 260 separate execution places of between 5 to 35, 40 people have already been identified and are being documented by local historians at the moment. This is the camp in Lety in the Czech Republic. Another one here. This is Camp Hodonín, which also at the moment is being turned into a museum. And of course, the Nazi allies also carried out this policy. So you've probably heard of the infamous concentration camp, the Croatian concentration camp, Jasenovac, run by the Croatian fascists, the Ustaši. We have at least 20,000 Roma victims confirmed there. So probably more, but 20,000 have already been confirmed, and their mass graves have been identified in the last 10 years. Hungary has is working on it. There were mass deportations in Hungary from Dachau to Buchenwald and Mauthausen in 1944 and 1945. The local Roma community is being collected also in a kind of a collection camp on the Danube in what is called Csillagérőd in Komárom, and then being transported not in death marches but in barges actually up the Danube towards these concentration camps. Romania has a special history of its own, which is being researched, has been researched, where parts of the Roma population, this is, by the way, this is Jasenovac, where parts of the Roma population of the country, especially of the eastern part of the country, was deported in the winter into what is called Transnistria, so an area that would nowadays be the territory of the Republic of Moldavia. Yeah, so across the river Dniester, therefore Transnistria, and something like 35,000 people were just sort of kicked across the river there, and many of them perished. A very large percentage of them perished. So these are this is the current research that is going on. And we've already heard that numbers, Jessica already said that numbers is a very difficult topic. I want to, you see, I've rattled this list of names of camps to you. They have become what the French historian Pierre Nora has called lieux de mémoire, places of remembrance, symbolic places of remembrance for a new generation of European Roma. The European Roma who were always branded as people who were illiterate and could not be integrated into European society, nowadays present a completely different picture. You have thousands and thousands of young Roma that have finished their university studies, that have hold very important positions in government, but also in business, in firms, in enterprises, in administration. And they have developed a new kind of historical identity in which actually the Roma genocide plays a very central role. Now, this is something I think the reasons for this is something that we could discuss in September, but these place names that I've been mentioning here, they actually are very symbolic places, and there are some very symbolic names also. I would like to mention some of them to you. Excuse me. Settler Steinbach, I will come to her. Sidonie Adlersburg, who was an orphan who was deported to Auschwitz as a 10-year-old child alone, a fate not dissimilar to that of many other children. Anne Frank, for example, Karl Stoica and his sister Chaya Stoica, and Sonny Weiss. Sidonie Adlersburg is this child that was deported alone to Auschwitz and of course died there, had no chance of survival. Karl Stoica was deported together with his whole family. He survived. He was actually in Mengeles program of experiments. He survived and he became a painter, one of the few. You can see him here in his later years on the right on top. And he started to paint very late, and he produced a lot of pictures about his experiences in the camps and persecution. You will find his work in different kinds of exhibitions all over the world by now. So he's one of the few who actually produced pictures together with his sister Chaya Stoica, who to my mind is the better artist. And she had a very beautiful exhibition of her work a couple of years ago in Paris. If you get the chance to see some of her work, do so. And the last one is here. And this is a symbolic picture, and I will end actually with this more or less. It is Settler Steinbach. This photograph was one of the most published photographs in school books after 1945 in Germany, the Netherlands, England, etc. It was called The Girl with the Headscarf. It was taken in the Camp Westerbork in the Netherlands when a transport for Auschwitz was leaving, and this girl was looking out just before the doors were being slammed shut. And this photograph served as a kind of symbol for the unknown Holocaust victim, yeah? A young girl, no name, etc. And the girl with the headscarf, everybody in post-war Western Europe knew this picture. Turns out in the year 2004 or 5, a journalist actually found out that she was not a Jewish girl, but a girl from a local Sinti family, Settler Steinbach, whose hair had just been shorn off in the camp. That's why she is wearing this headscarf, because she is so ashamed that she has lost all her hair. And I think it's very typical of our perception of this whole story. So there is this photograph that has been in front of our eyes for all these decades, and we failed to see it, and we failed to recognize what it really represents. And I think this is true for most of the fate of the Roma and Sinti during the Holocaust. As I said, we are not going to talk about these topics and about what there is to say. I want to end on a positive note. Of course, there were exceptions also. And this is a story from a very small village on the border to Hungary. And there were two Roma families. The one was the local blacksmith, and the other one was his brother-in-law and his family, an agricultural worker. And in 1943, when the deportation to Auschwitz comes, the Nazis arrive with a lorry, and they start to load these people up onto a lorry, and the local farmers assemble, and they protest, and they say, we are a farming village, we can't do without a smith, a blacksmith. So they manage to get the blacksmith and his family off the lorry, and they stay in the village, and nobody will touch them till the end of the war. The brother-in-law with his family is deported to Auschwitz, and they will all perish in Auschwitz. But I think it is a very good example. All this kind of execution of deportation, it always needs the support of the local population. And if the local population is not prepared to support this kind of policy, none of this is possible or would have been possible. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think I've used up my time. Yes, all of it actually. And I hope you could enjoy it, and I will be able to answer some of your questions. So I will take this out, sorry. So there we are.
Thank you, Dr. Baumgartner. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and I will ask them to our guest. One thing that really struck me, and thank you for this wonderful presentation, I think you really enhanced all of our understanding of this particular victims group and their experience in the Holocaust. One thing you mentioned a few times is how research has changed, referencing, you know, especially this looking at photographs differently. I wonder if you could talk about that just a little bit more. Is there any one particular incident or event that triggered this shift, or people's, you know, to make them look, instead of at the Gestapo, to the other police? And how, you know, in this sense then, how has that impacted research?
I think, yes, I quite agree. This was one of the decisive moments there. So research into the persecution of Roma and Sinti by the Nazis started in the late 1970s, but there were one or two instances. There were some solitaires, so to speak. There's a small booklet with recollections of Roma survivors, actually from 1965, but the work was not continued. It was published by a Viennese librarian, a woman who was herself a survivor, Selma Steinmetz. But the work really starts in the 1980s. And it is started by a group of activists from minority groups. So there is a journal called Pogrom, and the society is called Gesellschaft für bedrohte Völker, so the Society for Endangered Peoples. And they also start to investigate the story of this Roma persecution, basically. But as I said, they don't get very far because they always think that they have to find the same kind of documents as we have for the Jews and by the same kind of perpetrators. And this number of 500,000 is actually also an inspired guess in 1981 by the director of this institution, who is a scholar in Göttingen, German University of Göttingen, Tilman Zülch, who sort of says, okay, 6 million Jews, probably something like 500,000, and we call it that, yeah, for basically for a publicity purpose, I would say, yeah. Of course, he had an idea what it could be, and I think as maybe you have followed this discussion, historians have been able to establish a number of over 250,000 documented victims. Yeah, but of course there is this vast area of Eastern Europe where very little research has been done, although there is lots and lots of documents. You wouldn't believe it. Yeah, but as I said, you have to realize, first of all, you have to go and look at the documents and see who is doing what. And then you need a very good understanding of Nazi administration. That is actually something that we did not have at the time, and nobody had. Yeah. So the big archives, you know, they were not open, and there were no big funds for this kind of research. Yeah. And there is tons and tons of paper in the German what is called Bundesarchiv, yeah, to look into these things, and you will find the most interesting things in places where you don't expect it, and then you have to sort of figure out how did Nazi administration work, and this is when actually the important things were found. Yeah, so, and that happens in the late 1990s. From then on, we are on a different track. And now actually researchers in Central Europe are trying to find out whether the same thing happens in their countries with these other allied institutions, or maybe the situation is completely different, as I said, with Serbia. Serbia is a completely different story. So Bosnia, there is very little in Bosnia because many Muslims when many Gypsies in Bosnia are Muslims, and the Muslim communities tend to protect all their members. Yeah, the same is true in part of occupied Soviet Union in the Crimean Peninsula. Yeah, very well documented Tatar Muslim communities who protect their Romani members. Yeah, from deportation, etc. So there is, it depends on a lot of facts. It needs some good research. The problem is that we are sort of 50 years late. The research on the Holocaust started very late, but for the Roma and Sinti, there is another gap of 25 to 30 years. So we could say that in the 1990s, it really takes off. So now we are 25 to 30 years into this research, and the picture is becoming clearer. Yeah, I think
that, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think that's an excellent reminder of how you know, history is always evolving, and what we're learning is a continual process. It, you know, like you said, depends greatly on the archives and what we can find, and I think that that's a great message to keep that in mind. We've had a couple questions about the experience of the Roma within these camps. I wonder if one thing that certainly we've talked about in regards to other victims, particularly, you know, Jewish victims in the camps, are language differences between inmates, and how that, you know, is an added difficulty of life. Could you speak a little bit to, were there different language groups amongst the Roma and the Sinti, and if there were, did that impact their ability to communicate and survive, and just anything to their sort of, you know, language groups?
I don't think that language is a problem in the camps, especially not for Roma. So for two reasons. You can hardly imagine a more polyglot kind of community than the Roma communities. Yeah. Usually they speak all the languages, since they are at the bottom, very often at the bottom of the social ladder, so to speak. Yeah, they usually speak all the other languages of the region, which is a known phenomenon, well documented by linguists. So they usually speak the Romani dialect, and they speak 7 other languages to a certain degree. So in camps like Auschwitz or many others, they can always sort of communicate with basically everybody. Yeah? On the other hand, the Roma dialects of Europe are, say, diverse dialects, but of more or less the same language. So the similarities are so big that even today, Romani speakers from different parts of Europe, they can get on. Yeah? They can understand themselves. They have their problems because of different loan words. And actually what is nowadays taking place is through the internet. Yeah? For the first time actually in the internet, a sort of standardized version of European Romani is evolving, because these young people are using the language, and they come from completely different dialectal backgrounds. Yeah? And they are, in many ways, they are getting rid of these loan words from their languages of origin. Modern life has lots and lots of English loan words. So there is something new is being established at the moment. A very interesting phenomenon, also because there is a strong Romani student movement. When you, should you happen to go to Auschwitz in one August, in the week before the ceremony, on the 2nd of August, there is usually a big student camp there organized by the Romani student organization, Internment. And there's usually up to 1,000 participants in the city. Yeah? And it's fantastic to see how they all, of course, they try to speak Romani, and if they don't manage, then they have 2, 3, 4, 5 different languages that they can use. So there is no problem there. The relationship between the Roma and the non-Roma is a very complicated topic. Now, first of all, we have to say that after the war, what we can see, there is a very strong solidarity among survivors. Yeah. And also all the famous Jewish survivors, for Wiesenthal. Yes, Wiesenthal was a very strong supporter of research into the genocide of the Roma and Sinti. Yeah. So this question, which is nowadays a political question, so is there only a Jewish Holocaust, and is the persecution of the Roma and Sinti a genocide? Yeah, but not part of the Holocaust. Yeah, this would have been very strange, I think, to somebody like Wiesenthal. But it is something that you can discuss, and I don't think it is for me personally, it's not a very important question, I have to say. In the camps, the relationships were very, very complicated. In Auschwitz, there is very little contact of Roma with non-Roma. Yeah? We have reports. We have some reports from the underground movement. Yeah, there were some underground groups, especially communists mainly. They knew about what was going on in the Roma camp. They couldn't really do a lot for them, I think. Very often, especially the political prisoners, were many of them despised the Roma. So there is a factor there that sometimes Roma were being used as capos, yeah, like professional criminals in the camps. Yeah? So this has a very strong effect. We have some reports, and there is an American historian of Austrian origin, actually, whose name eludes me at the moment, Aronovich, I think, who is writing and researching this topic. There is a lot of, for example, in Ravensbrück in the last days of the war, yeah, when Roma and Jewish survivors were sort of being brought back to Ravensbrück from other camps, there is a lot of conflict there. Yeah? So between the Roma and between the Jews. So the situation is not very nice. This is very, I think, very difficult to understand, and I would not like to generalize, I have to say. Yeah? The situation is so extreme, yeah, in these last months in concentration camps that I think it's not easy to understand what is going on. Yeah? But people were traumatized by it. Yeah? People were really traumatized by it. That many Roma were very aggressive to Jews, and some Jews were very aggressive to Roma in these times. So we have very, very contradictory reports. So there is no general picture that I can see that has evolved here. Yeah? But it's not free of conflict. That, of course, is certain. Yeah.
Well, and this may be something for our last question that you may deal with on the panel presentation coming up later. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit since, as you mentioned at the beginning, persecution, of course, continues, post the Nazi period, how that has, if it has, impacted memorialization efforts across Europe.
It has for a very long time. I mean, basically, the persecution of the Roma and Sinti was not recognized at all. Yeah? So they were not recognized as survivors of Nazi persecution for a long, long time. So one of the first documents that we have, interesting documents that we have, is a film by a Swedish cameraman, actually, he is, who is of German origin, and he is married to a Hungarian wife, maybe of Roma descent, I don't know. And he is, he's called Nestler, still alive, close to 100, living in Sweden. And he travels through Hungary and Austria and Germany and some other parts of Europe, interviewing Roma survivors about their experiences in the camps and about the present situation. The film is being broadcast in '65 in Sweden and has been found actually in the archives of Swedish TV. It's very, very interesting, but it is a very singular document, yeah? Because there is nothing, or we thought actually that there was nothing like this. Yeah? We know very little, and nobody actually was looking for the material. Roma were not recognized. This starts to change basically in the 1960s a little bit, and then in the 1970s. But still, there is this overall impression that the Roma, yes, they were persecuted on racist grounds, but since they are basically illiterate, that is the assumption, which is completely wrong, of course. Yeah? They never left any documents. There are no written documents, etc. And they didn't want to speak about it. This is the other one. So there was this fable, actually, basically, that the Roma didn't want to talk about it because they didn't want, and they also didn't want non-Roma to learn the language because they wanted to keep it secret, and they were afraid to talk, etc., etc., etc. None of this is true. A German, one of the first class scholars of Roma Holocaust, I think, is a woman from Germany, Carola Finks. Yeah? And Carola Finks has started a project a couple of years ago. It was called Forgotten Voices. Please look it up in the internet. Yeah? And she managed, with the help of a lot of us, to find written testimonies from during the war and the first post-war years of Roma survivors about their persecution from every European country, at least 3 examples. Yeah? So all of a sudden there is a body of 100 personal accounts of persecution. Yeah? So the picture here is changing very, very quickly. And we have to throw these old, I must say, prejudices about Roma. We just have to throw them overboard. As I said, Roma population was very diverse, and we still suffer from this idea that we can recognize Roma on the grounds of the social status. This is just not true. The moment where they have kind of social upwards mobility, we tend to lose sight of them as gypsies, so-called gypsies, and we just don't perceive them as gypsies anymore. And they don't count as gypsies then, and we still how to say have this old romantic little prejudice that they are, you know, noble savages, but this is of course not true.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you again for this presentation. I look forward to hearing from you again on September 14th when Dr. Baumgartner will be back with us on the non-Jewish victims panel. Again, that's September 14th, again at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Our very next talk in the Auschwitz speaker series is August 24th, also at 2 p.m. With Anna Haikova, who will be talking about Theresienstadt and deportations from the West. So again, thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to our partners at Union Station. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, George. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Shelley. It's been wonderful. Thank you for having me. A very great opportunity for me. I'm very proud that I could participate in that, and I'm looking forward to September. Have a nice summer, all of you. Bye-bye.